John 6 that until we get to that, until we end up where we just sang about, this text doesn't make that much sense. So in John 6, verse 66, very long chapter, verse 66, and from this time, many of those disciples turned back and no longer followed him. This is the turning curve. So Jesus' public ministry and popularity crescendo at the feeding of the 5,000, which might as well have been the 20,000 because the 5,000 were just the men. So you had all the women and children to that. 20,000 people got fed by 5 loaves, 2 fish. That was the pinnacle. That was the top. The very next couple of days, he preaches a sermon on the fact that he is the bread of life. And the people wanted the bread and fish. They wanted physical bread. They're ready to make him king because he could make food. And they like that. They want to grow their own food. But Jesus preaches a sermon on the bread of life, that he is the bread of life. And apparently those words were so tough that the people left. On hearing it, many of his disciples said, "This is hard teaching. Who can accept it?" And aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, "Does this sermon offend you? What if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life. The flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you are spirit, and they are life. Yet there are some of you who do not believe." For Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. He went on to say, "This is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled them to." And then the verse I just read. So from this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. It's a confusing time to a degree. And yet Jesus looks at his disciples here, verse 67, and he says to his 12 disciples, "You want to leave too? Are you going to forsake?" And for the first time, Peter speaks. Well, not the first time Peter speaks. Peter speaks all the time. But the first time, Peter speaks what all of them were ready to say. He is the voice of all 12 disciples. Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom would we go? Who would we go to? You alone have the words of everlasting life. We believe and know that you are the Holy One of God." So, why? Why? Because Peter and the disciples wanted the same thing all the crowd wanted. They were excited about 5,000 people being fed at one time, well, even more than that, and then 4,000 2 days later. They were as excited about what they thought the kingdom of God was going to be, an overthrow of Rome, finally people standing up, and it was going to go right there from the Sea of Galilee is where it was going to start. And they were on the grassroots of this thing, and they were excited. They were wondering who's going to be on the right, who's going to be on the left. The disciples were part of the confusion about who Jesus was and what he came to do. So why, when he gives this tough sermon, and by the way, that's our message for next week. Jesus, the bread of life, is our message for next Sunday. So we're going to take a look at it. We'll see if it cuts our population down. It can't go much smaller, can we? But when Jesus finished that sermon, people left and didn't come back. So why, when Peter voiced what they all were saying, something happened between the day that Jesus fed the 5,000 people, because they hadn't thought ahead to plan and bring their food with them, to the next day when he starts going around and everywhere he goes, people are being healed just by touching their hem. Let's take a look at that. Let's take a look at Mark 6. let's pick it up in verse 54. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout the whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard that he was. And wherever he went, into villages or into towns or anywhere in the countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. And they begged him to let them touch the edge of his cloak. And all who touched him were healed. Where did they get that idea? That all it takes is to touch the hem of his cloak. Don't you remember? It was the woman with the issue of blood. And she thought, if I could just touch his clothing, that'd be all it takes. And Jesus saw her and told her that her faith had healed her. Well, apparently that story had gotten around. That story was pretty popular. The folks had heard that. And so now everybody who touches the cloak of Jesus, this is right before the sermon on I am the bread of life. In other words, this is maybe the best biblical example of common grace. Jesus healed those who touched him, some of whom gave their lives to him, many of whom turned their back on him, and once they got what they wanted, they moved on. But Jesus had a ministry to everybody that he came in contact with and touched them, they were healed. And that's one of the reasons that I have been thankful for the year of partnership with Victory Outreach. They run ministry that way too. Victory Outreach will take anybody off the street and into their home to show them the grace of Jesus Christ. And there may be a lot of those people who go right back to the same simple lifestyle. But Victory Outreach doesn't worry about that. They try to present common grace to every person that they come in contact with, knowing that the Lord's going to be the one who sorts that out. And I'm so thankful for watching how they do ministry right here in our midst. And this is their last Sunday. They're going to their new building next week. But I'm thankful that this has been a season where I can watch ministry-minded people who just live out common grace to everybody. It's not like people have to fit a form or fit a mold in order to fit into that. That's what makes the passage where Jesus realizes they're all leaving kind of sad when you realize how much he loved them. Let's read the story. And I'll probably interrupt myself as I'm reading because I don't really have notes. I don't have to remember the things that I've studied about them. But it starts at verse 45. Now, Mark is all about the action, right? And he's writing to a Greek audience. He's writing to Gentiles. And he is pretty much he wasn't there, so he's pretty much getting his first-hand knowledge from Peter. So Mark is writing down the stories as Peter gives them to him. But Mark, in his own style, likes the word immediately. And there's hardly any way that everything that happens in Mark is immediate. And almost every paragraph starts with, and immediately this happened. And sure enough, right after the number of men who had eaten was 5,000. We'll go back a little bit to verse 42. And they start off with 5 loaves, 2 fish. They all ate and were satisfied. Now that word satisfied means filled. They were almost overfed. Satisfied, and the disciples picked up the 12 basketfuls. Jesus was feeding people bread that had not grown from wheat in the ground. He was feeding them fish that had never swum, whatever it is. These fish, the fish meat that Jesus was serving, probably the best fish fry in all of history. But as he broke it apart, it just continued to grow until there were 12 baskets full. And if we read in the other accounts, we go back to John's gospel and look at Matthew's gospel, we find out that the people wanted to make him king. Right then, this is someone who can feed us. This is someone who has access to power and resources. We won't have to work a day in our lives because he's going to make the food. And they were ready to make him king. And Jesus hurriedly, verse 45, immediately Jesus made his disciples get in the boat. The word made, and that's an interesting word, it's the same word in the Greek that Jesus used that Luke uses when Jesus cleanses the table. When he made the people, there were money changers, when he made them leave and kicked them out, it was that amount of force. Jesus put his disciples in the boat and said, go. Because the disciples were in danger of falling under the spell of, we've got a king. They were in danger of coming to the same conclusion that many of the people did. Verse 45, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida. That's the house of fish. Apparently there's a lot of fish in the Sea of Galilee. But Bethsaida. And while he dismissed the crowd, and after leaving them, he went on up onto a mountain. Now that little verse, that little phrase, he dismissed the crowd. How did he do that? They're all excited. They're all pumped up. There's 5,000 men and a whole bunch of women and children, and they all want to make him king. How does he disperse the crowd? Remember when people heard Jesus preach, and they said, we've never heard someone speak with this kind of authority. Apparently when Jesus told them to leave, they heard the authority. So the disciples are in the boat. He leaves them in the crowd, and after leaving them, he went up on the mountainside. Now, it's a hill. We wouldn't call it a mountain today, but the hills around Galilee, they call it mountains. Up on the mountainside to pray. Now, you all know that Jesus was a man of prayer. We think of that. We see in the chorus. Jesus didn't preach every day, spent a lot of his time praying. Do you know there's really only 3 accounts where Jesus gets aside to pray? Now, we know that he prays, but there's only 3 recorded times. One is the 40 days before he chose the disciples. The next is John 17, where he prays for his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane before he's arrested. We have that recorded. And right in the middle, we have him praying on the mountainside. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. So the first one was to call the disciples. The second one was to empower the disciples to hold on as he was getting ready to be crucified, praying for them that they would see that he and the Father were one, and that they could be one as well. Remember that, because this is this middle time. This is the second time that Jesus steps aside to pray. When evening came, and that's first watch, Roman soldiers divided the night into 4 watches. So you have 6 to 9, 3 hours, 9 to midnight, 3 hours, midnight to 3, third watch, 3 hours, and then 3 to 6, the 4th watch. So there's 4 watches in a Roman soldier's night watch. And you would get assigned one. If you were on night watch to be standing guard, all right, you're going to take third watch. Oh man, that's from 12 to 3. Okay. Try to go back to sleep afterwards, but it's going to be hard. Those are the watches. Well, the first watch, when evening came, 47, first watch, the boat was in the middle of the lake. That'd be second watch. First watch, he puts them in there and says, get out of here. Go to Bethsaida. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the lake. Now that doesn't really strike you until you look at the map and realize where they started from and where they were going to was Bethsaida. So it's over on the east side of the lake, and they were going from the southeast corner to the northeast corner. So it should have been a shoreline cruise. They should have been pretty close to shore, just kind of heading. It was about 4.5 miles, 5 miles sailing journey. It took about 11 miles to hike around those hills and take the trail around. But Jesus told them to just go there. So why are they in the middle of the lake? Well, you read the story, you find out why they ended up being blown into the middle of the lake. Northern wind, an eastern wind blew up. Well, in the second watch, that 9 to 12, he saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. And then there's a period, and then it says about the 4th watch, he went out to them walking on the lake. He let them row. He let them fight the storm with every bit of strength they had. They'd been rowing since 6 o'clock. He looked up at midnight. They were still rowing against the wind, trying to fight for their lives in the middle of the lake. And Jesus waited 3 more hours. Why would he do that? Why would he wait 3 more hours? I think he wanted to get those disciples to the point where they were at their last breath, their last, the final rope. There's nothing left. They tried everything they could. But here's the important thing. They're on the lake, so all they can see is the waves because of the wind. But Jesus is on the mountainside or the hillside looking down on the lake, how he sees the center of the lake, which had to be 2.5, 3 miles away in the middle of the night, God must have allowed him to see his disciples who he loved. I think, now it's not in the text, I'm not sure about this, but I think that Jesus was praying for those disciples, because we find out later that their hearts were hardened. They hadn't believed because of the loaves and fish. Their hearts had been hardened. I believe Jesus was praying to the Father that the hearts of his disciples would be softened and ready. And he allowed them to struggle to their absolute finish in the middle of that lake. Now the disciples knew that Jesus had the power over wind and water and waves, didn't they? Because it had just been 4 or 5 months previous. Remember, he was asleep in the back of the boat. They were trying to go across the lake. They say, Master, don't you care that we're about to die? And Jesus looks at him and had to wake him up. He woke up and told the wind to be still. Immediately the sea had calmed. So the disciples knew that Jesus had the power over wind and water. But they also knew that he was not in their boat with them. But here's the thought that I want you to really take to heart. He had put them in the boat. They were in the center of the palm of God's will for their lives in that moment. They could not be more centered in what they were doing in God's will. Jesus had told them to get in the boat, go to here. They got in the boat and they went there. There are storms in your life that will come to you when you are in the center of God's will. And sometimes we're tempted to think, I must have missed something here. I must have really disappointed God. I must have sinned and done something awful because this storm is about to take my life and destroy me. And maybe it's an emotional storm, maybe it's a relational storm, maybe it's just the things in life, circumstances of life. We tend to think we must have done something wrong if things are going all coming apart, don't we? That's just kind of our assumption. But these disciples were exactly where Jesus told them to go and doing exactly what God wanted them to do, and still the storm raged around them. I hope that means you're going to take heart. I hope that means, because if you're not in a storm now, that means you've got to either come out of one or getting ready to go into one. The rest of your life, you're going to be in some kind of a storm, some kind of opposition, some kind of obstacle. Storms are a part of our life. And you might be in the worst storm of your life when you are exactly in the center of God's will and purpose for you. So I want you to take that to heart and to make that a spiritual marker for yourself. I think Jesus was on that mountain praying for those disciples. And he wanted what was best for them, but they waited the fourth watch. The one who had put them in the boat the first watch, had been praying for them for second watch, observed them during the third watch and watched them strain. About the fourth watch, that would have been 3 o'clock in the morning, he went out to them walking on the lake. He was about to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost, and they cried out. Now, that's not really a good translation. They screamed in sheer terror is actually a better translation. Because they all saw him, and they were terrified. And immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." 7 times, 8 times in the New Testament. Take courage, don't be afraid. 7 to the disciples, 1 to Paul, and 1 to Damascus. But it is I. Now, I'm going to mess up the Greek words, I'm sorry, y'all. But the first word in there, in that it is I, it's like, it's where we get the word ego. So egos or egos. The second word is elio, which is also, it's like saying I that I. It's the Greek way of saying the Old Testament concept that first appeared at the burning bush when Moses says, "Who is speaking to me from this bush that is burning?" And God answers, "I am that I am." Jesus clearly identifies himself to the disciples When we say it is I, he is saying, I am that I am. I'm here. I've come to you. Don't be afraid. He spoke to them and said, take courage. It is I. Now, this is only in Mark. It says that he was about to pass by them, because he told them he was going to meet them at Bethsaida. And that's only in Mark. We don't have that in John. We don't have that in Matthew. And I'm not sure why he was passing by, but I think he was identifying himself not only by saying, I am that I am. If you take a look at theophanies, that's the appearance of God in historical narrative, God passes by in almost all those stories. When Elijah is hiding up in the cave in the side of the mountain, and God says, I'm going to pass by, and a mighty wind roars by me. God wasn't in the wind, and a mighty storm comes by, and God was in the storm, and then a still small voice. Elijah saw passing by different representations as God told him, I'm going to come by the mouth of your cave. We can go back a little bit further than that. Go back to Moses, who asked God, can I see your glory? And God said, you can't see me and live. So I'm going to hide you in this cliff of this rock, and I'm going to pass by, and you can see my back. And apparently that exposure made Moses glow for days and weeks afterwards, because God passed by where Moses was. And you can go back to Abraham. Abraham was asked by God to step into a covenant. And he divided large animals in half. It was a pretty bloody, gruesome sight. And then the lantern of God, or the oven of God, passed through those animals to say, I'm the one keeping this covenant. I'm the one who am showing you, passing through, because that's how covenants were made back then. You divide an animal, and when you step through those carcasses, you would be saying to the person you're making a covenant to, may it be to me what has happened to this animal that is on either side of me if I break this covenant. Covenants were serious business. And Abraham, in his covenant with God, it is God who passes by. It is God who says, I'm going to keep this covenant. You're not going to always keep it, but I'm going to. God has been passing by since the Garden of Eden. When he came passing by through the garden, and Adam was hiding and Eve is hiding, and he said, where are you? He said, well, we knew we were naked, so we hid. And God said, well, what have you done? He was passing by and said, what have you done? Jesus is taking this Old Testament picture of God passing by and takes this example of crossing a lake, passing by the ship, but this time, instead of saying, disciples, what have you done? Jesus responds to their cry as they cry out to him. And the God who has been passing by through the entire Old Testament now turns and goes directly to their point of need and comes to them and says, look what I have done. Up until this point, the disciples may have thought, this is about a year, 3/4, almost 2 years into the ministry, the disciples may well have thought that they had chosen to follow Jesus. But when Jesus, who is walking on the water, and they think it's a ghost, and they scream in terror, and he says, don't be afraid, I am that I am, I'm coming to you, and he turns from passing by and comes to them at the boat, they realize they thought they did the choosing, but Jesus had chosen them all along. That's true for you too. Sometimes you're going to think, well, I chose to follow Christ. I chose to believe the scriptures are real. I chose to be a member of a church. None of that happens apart from Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, choosing us and coming to us at our point of need. And he climbed in the boat with them, and the wind died down. Verse 51, they were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. I told you that was in there. They had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. So that day, at the feeding of 5,000, they still had hard hearts. Their hearts were beginning to soften up a little bit now. And when they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. And as soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. That was about all that Peter wanted to recall and recount for Mark to write down. Aren't you glad that Matthew was there too? Because Matthew tells us more of this story than Mark does. And Mark, remember, Peter's kind of wanting to downplay some of the story. But Peter has a pretty important role here for us to learn from. So we're going to turn over to Matthew 14, take a look at the same account. Matthew 14, during the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the lake, and when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said. They cried out in fear, but Jesus immediately said to them, I am that I am. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, said Jesus. Tell me is how the NIV has translated. It's command. Jesus, if that's you, command me to come on the water. And Jesus says, come. Now, I've heard a whole lot of sermons about this all my life, a lot of Bible stories. People like to point out that, folks are kind of critical of Peter because he takes his eyes off Jesus and he begins to sink. Let's read that. Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. And he cried out, Lord, save me! And immediately, there's that word again. Matthew picks up a little bit of Mark, because Mark written first. So Matthew actually has a few immediately's. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him and said, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Peter walked on water. And I've heard preachers and teachers say, well, we can't give Peter too much of a hard time because the other disciples stayed in the boat. And Peter's the only one who got out and actually was walking on water. There's only 2 people recorded in all of history that have walked on top of water because it's kind of impossible. If you step on the water, you go down to the bottom. The only 2 people who have done it are the Lord himself, Jesus, and Peter. Walked on top of the water to go to the Savior. And I've heard some people say we shouldn't give Peter too hard a time because better a wet Peter than a dry Thomas. And I understand the sentiment. I get it. I think they're all pretty wet because of the storm and the waves. In fact, maybe the boat was almost sunk by this point. But I'm not sure that that's really what happened. I'm not sure that Peter had more courage than the rest of them. I think they all had a fear response. It says that they were terrified. There are 2 responses to fear, and I work with people in crisis, and so I see these 2 responses quite often. One of them is paralysis by fear, where you can't move. We had somebody hurt, one of my assistants got hurt pretty bad one time because they were being attacked by a student who was in a rage, and they did not go to safety. They thought they were in a place that was safety, but they did not get out of there. They did not leave. They just stood there and took it. Actually crouched down on the floor and just took the beating. And it was awful. We had to change some things. Went along after that where everybody in our campus carries a 2-way radio with them at all times. But I remember that's one reaction to fear. I've taught on fear when I teach on crisis prevention and intervention. The paralysis that can happen with fear. The other response to fear is a fight or flight response. And they're almost 2 sides of the same coin. Fight or flight. You run away or you fight through it, but you are immediately given a shot of adrenaline and you have action. And the same person who is likely to fight is also the same person who's likely to flight, depending on which one their brain kicks in. Peter was certainly one with a fight or flight response. You take a look at his life. He cuts off a soldier's ear, Jesus' arrest. And other times he's just impulsive. He's a fight or flight kind of guy. Peter knew that that boat was not going to sink him. And rather than hanging onto that boat that they've been fighting on for 9 hours now, instead of hanging on to that which he knew was going to sink, he flew as fast as he could to the one who he knew had power over the water. He said, command me. Not because he had all kinds of courage, because he wanted to get to where Jesus was. Man, that's a lesson for us too, isn't it? That when we realize that we can't do anything about our circumstances, to get to Jesus as quickly as we possibly can. He starts to walk, which had to be amazing. And then he notices the storm. He starts noticing when he takes his eyes off of Jesus, which is the person he was trying to get to, and he starts to look around at his own surroundings, and then fear comes back in. Peter begins to sink, and Peter cries out one of the most heartfelt prayers, and I hope you've prayed it in your life too. Lord, save me. 3-word prayer. It's a beautiful prayer. It's a wonderful prayer that Jesus wants to hear and longs to answer by saying yes. We get back to the boat, and the water immediately calms. We extend his hand, why do you doubt? Oh, and that you of little faith, don't think of that necessarily as a criticism on Jesus' part. Faith comes from Father. And you of little faith is just an identifier. It's not a criticism. Jesus is thrilled that there's a little bit of faith there. He wants that faith to grow. And so when he looks at your life and says, ye of little faith, he's not putting you down. He's letting you know that he sees the faith that is there, and he just wants to call it out so it might grow. When they climbed in the boat, verse 32 of Matthew 14, the wind died down, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. I love this. I love this story, and I love the fact that it's a worship. And then they get this next part. And when they crossed over, they landed in Gennesaret. When the men of that place recognized Jesus. Let's go back to John, because there's some really cool little message there. Back to John 6. It is I, don't be afraid. When they got okay, then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Did you catch that? Okay, it's in chapter 6, verse 21. Starting in 20. But he said to them, it is I, don't be afraid. And then verse 21. Then they were willing to take him into the boat, because they knew he was not a ghost. And immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. That's at least 2 miles. It was a quantum leap. They were in the middle of the lake when he saw them in the 3rd watch and walked to them in the 4th watch. They're in the middle of the lake, and then they're at the shore. A quantum leap is when you go from point A to point B with never actually going through the space between. It was one of the reasons that Einstein went to his death discouraged, because he knew he could observe it. He could observe quantum leaps, but he couldn't explain them scientifically. He couldn't get his mind around it, but he knew that happened as he observed astrophysics. A quantum leap happened right here on the Sea of Galilee. I love that. That's just a little side there, that they didn't have to row anymore, is what I'm saying. And it wasn't like they just kind of just moved across the lake. No, they stopped being the center and they were at the shore. It reminds me of the story of Philip when he's on the road and he's talking to the Ethiopian eunuch, and God just took him from that spot and took him to another town. and it was almost like Star Trek, where you beam me up kind of thing. They were beamed to the other side of the lake. That's just a little tidbit there that I love. Back to Matthew. They worshipped. Sorry, I told you I was going to be kind of scattered today. You of little faith, he says to Peter, when they climbed in the boat, the wind died down, and those who were in the boat worshipped him and said, truly you are the Son of God. Jesus spent a night, I believe, praying for his disciples. And their worry became worship. So that's what they did. Their fear was transformed into freedom. Freedom from that storm. That's what he did. So there's something they did, they worshipped. There's something that Jesus did. But their helplessness in their circumstances was changed to hope. That was the result. In Celebrate Recovery, we talk about the 3 W's. We talk about the Word of Christ, or words, the worship of Christ, and the works of Christ. When we separate into small groups and speak forgiveness over each other and hear each other's confession in our small group time. So the works of Christ, the words of Christ, and the worship of Christ. When the works of Christ to save these disciples, and they were experienced, many of them were experienced fishermen. They knew the lake. They knew the boat. They knew that they had to be facing into the wind if they were not going to get capsized. They knew how to sail or row. But when all that happened, the words of Christ took on a whole different place in hearts that were softened by that encounter. The worship of Christ that happened in that boat, and the works of Christ saving them in that boat, caused them to realize that the words of Christ were all important. And that's why Peter stands up after all the other disciples leave the very next day. He says, who do we turn to? You're the only one who has the words of everlasting life. We don't even understand them. We don't even understand the sermon you just preached, but we're going to hang in there. We're going to stay here because we thought we had chosen you. And now we recognize that you chose us to save us, to make us whole. We're going to hang on to you because you're the only one who has the words of everlasting life. Didn't matter whether they understood all the sermons, because they sure didn't. Didn't matter if they understood all the parables, because they really didn't. But there's a turning point here in the public ministry of Christ where they crescendos in his popularity and begins to drop down in his popularity. But the disciples, right after that, in that Sea of Galilee, they lock on. They say, we are a part of what you want us to do, and your words are the words of everlasting life. And I hope that that is your testimony as well. That in the storms of life, because they're going to come, that you're going to hang on to the words of Christ. Because there isn't any life anywhere else. He keeps his promises. When we worship and he does his works, all of a sudden we begin to believe his word. Amen. I think I'm touching the chorus.